Welcome to the Beyond Body podcast with your hosts, Mia and Holly. Join us for a sometimes fortnightly podcast
where we explore all things mental health, being a messy human, and how to get the most out of this one precious life.
and all the ridiculous stories in between.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to us talking about things, commonly known as the Beyond Body podcast. Mia, my love, good evening to you. How are you?
Good morning to you, my Parisian little friend. I'm good. I am freezing cold, but I am heading to Bali again next month. For those of you who heard me say that about 8 weeks ago, no, you are not listening to an old episode. I'm going back. So I'll be heading back to Bali in a little under a month for another week, because as you wisely said to me, I went to Bali at the wrong time. I went before winter had even started. So I was like, well, then it's just logical that I have to go back now that winter's coming to an end and get sort of a little bit of that warmth back into the system.
And by the time you come back from it, spring will be in full floral execution. Like, it's the time to come back.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's all for all of these very practical, totally normal reasons, and not just because I'm getting out of here for a week. But how is Paris? What have you been doing?
I love Paris. It gets
Yeah.
such a bad rap. I feel like people sort of say, like, Parisian people are like mean and rude, and I don't think they're wrong, but I just love the city. I feel like I'm the biggest like cliche here. Like, I was like flying over here, like watching the new season of Emily in Paris. If anyone is Parisian that's listening to this will be like, that's a joke. But it's amazing. So I'm loving it here. It's been the best. It's been a really nice treat after coming from Tenerife, which I was rolling with the punches there. Like, I was.
Really?
Remember how on the last episode I was saying how I like lost my bag?
Yes.
From there, it ended up being this like 5-day phone war with the airline about where the bag actually was. And then I just went to the airport and it was sitting right there. I was like, why did no one call me? So I had to deal with that. And then I also missed a very expensive, non-refundable international flight on my way, like to get to Paris. So that was a bit of a blow. And then I also got like an incredibly expensive parking fine. And had to take a little trip in the little mini like Policia car because I accidentally parked on a roundabout. I have had such a hectic, chaotic 2 weeks. Which story do you want to hear about?
So you parked on a roundabout, and are you saying in a roundabout way that you got arrested? Why were you in a police car?
So it sounds worse than it is. When I say I parked on a roundabout, it wasn't like I parked like vertical on a roundabout. It's like it was this roundabout I didn't realize was a roundabout at this beach, and there was no other parks, and someone else had already done it. So I thought, I'll just park here, it's fine. And I said to myself when I got out of the car, what's the worst that can happen? I get a fine. I did indeed get a fine. Someone came, I was like laying at these rock pools. Someone came over with who looked like this person of authority, came over with a phone being like, is this your car? And I was like, oh no, what's happened? It's like something I thought the worst. Like, I was like catastrophizing. And then I had to go in the little mini Policia car. And I genuinely laughed because it was like a clown car. Like, I was like, this is the police car, to drive me back to where my car was. And then I just got like a horrible fine. But it's okay. It's the worst thing that can happen. I actually met a woman the other week, and she said the most profound thing. And it's really sad now that I've lost so much money on this flight and this parking fine. She said whenever she's lost money in her life, like either it's like a fine or a broken phone or whatever, she says to herself, I'm so grateful because that's all you've lost.
Yeah.
Like it's you're able to get money back. I was like, wow, that is incredibly profound.
Yeah.
And very relevant right now.
Yes. It's very like taken to an extreme. It's that whole thing of like, it's just numbers. It's just numbers flying through the air. I mean, what even is money? Like, it's just some abstract concept. What are we doing, right? Like,
but I'm laughing through it all. I'm happy to be in Paris.
Right.
I feel like I was really tested, even just driving a car on the other side of the road with like the GPS in Spanish. Like, I was so tested. But it's all part of the experience.
Fantastic. Where are you off to next? What's next on the map?
To Italy next.
Where in Italy are we going?
Going to Sicily, so spending some time on a very
Beautiful.
remote little island where I'm just going to meditate and there's no Wi-Fi or no reception or anything, which will be super nice. And
Mm.
then soon enough, my 90 days is going to be over and I've got to get out of Europe.
That
So
is crazy. How long have you been there for now?
maybe like almost 2 months.
I can't believe that.
It goes so fast. And
So
the fact that we're
fast.
almost in September is
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah.
This year has flown.
Because like we were just saying, like it's now almost, well, no, it's about now 3 months until the retreat. But we experience that every time we're like, oh, it's so far away. And then boom, pack up the car, off we go.
I know. We'll click our fingers and it'll be the Bali retreat.
It sure will be. Keep an eye out for Bali content from me if you want to know what that experience could be like. So Hol, what are we talking about today?
Well, I think today we might get a bit vulnerable. We'll
Mm,
see. This
mm,
is something we haven't really discussed before, I don't think. But in last week's episode, I mean, we don't do a weekly podcast, so we would never have time for that. A
yeah.
fortnight ago in the last episode, one of the listeners sent in a question, um, that was in the context of recovery fears about feeling like they wouldn't be attractive to a partner.
Mhm.
And I think it really got us thinking about intimacy in recovery and the role it plays in our life, just generally through all stages of healing. I think intimacy in itself is such a beautiful word,
Yeah.
and it's a really important part of a deep connected life,
Yeah.
and I think it often can be something that's quite overlooked in recovery, but it's absolutely an area that everyone is going to have to address sooner or later because it is this piece that allows us to have, I guess, a more meaningful, authentic experience with safe relationships. So we're just gonna share all of our opinions on this as we do. Mel, when you think about intimacy and recovery, what are some of the first things that sort of come to mind, and what are the intersections that you think are correlated with these two aspects?
I think the first word I think of is vulnerability,
Mm.
which is why it makes so much sense that people with eating disorders really struggle with intimacy. And when we're talking about intimacy, I think the first place people go is to like romantic intimacy or like sexual intimacy, which is obviously, yes, like very clear incarnations of the word, but it's intimacy on all levels. It's intimacy in friendships, it's intimacy with, family members. It's really that ultimate kind of all layers peeled back to expose kind of that
Yeah.
deepest, rawest, most authentic part of yourself. I think if anybody has listened to the episodes that you and I did with our best friends, I think that's a really beautiful demonstration of intimacy, of being able to like truly just meet someone where they are and to do it without judgment. And I think the way that I describe it when I know that I have true intimacy with somebody is that I feel seen, uh,
Mm.
and that I don't have to work to earn feeling and being seen.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you so much because I think, yeah, the first thing people think is like, oh, like sexual intimacy, which is absolutely relevant and definitely something that people with eating disorders can struggle with. But, there's physical intimacy, which I would even separate from sexual intimacy as well
Yeah.
as that emotional and intellectual. Like, I think, I consider physical intimacy, even things like hugging, holding hands, just sharing safe, physical space.
Yeah.
Even like my sister and I, like we hold hands all the time.
Mm.
People definitely think we're a couple, and it's just because we have just like a physically intimate relationship because we just love each other, right? Like that's like a form of intimacy for me with her. Or even like, just that long hug with a friend, as
Mm.
mundane as that little act might seem. I think that is an experience that can help you and that person really cultivate a closeness.
Yeah.
Because think about if you were someone that when you are hugged, you don't really connect with it and just like in,
Yeah.
out, pull away really quick. Like
Yeah.
that might be because there's this physical discomfort associated with the intimacy of it. And I
Mm-mm.
think I like that word you used, exposed, because that is what that is a hard-hitting word, isn't it?
Mhm.
That's what emotional intimacy is. It's really that ability to be able to share your deepest, most personal feelings with another person. And I think when you experience that kind of intimacy, like you're saying, you feel safe and secure enough to know that you're going to be understood and affirmed and considered, I think.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that looks like whether it's with like family members or a partner or friends, being able to share dreams or even just being able to say something that's upset you and advocate for your, emotional needs and be able
Yeah.
to emotionally process through conversation. And then I also think another really important part of it is that intellectual intimacy. So even that idea of just being able to like share your ideas and opinions
Yeah.
and questions and thoughts with someone, because I think it can be a really common thing for people to not necessarily share their opinion if they don't feel like it's valid or they feel like it won't be received. So I think to be able to do that,
Yeah.
there needs to sort of be a safe connection with whoever you are sharing with, because it doesn't feel good, right? If you're sharing something and you feel like there's no space for understanding, or if that person's sort of like my way or the highway approach. Because even
Yes.
if you don't, agree with someone else and you don't have the same opinion,
Mm.
they can still be respected.
Yes. When you were talking about sharing your dreams and sharing your visions, like you and I work, I mean, you and I are doing that with each other all the time, right? Where it's like we bring ideas to each other and we bring projects to each other and we bring like long term and short term. And, like even the way that I share with Josie, where I'll just like spitball the craziest shit in voice notes, being like, I think I'm going to do this. And I think I'm going to do that. And she's like, it's one of those days. Is that we're feeling very creative with our life today? Um, and I never fear feeling silly. I think that is
Yeah.
a sign of how uh that even when you are being silly, like, and I mean true silliness, like just when you're being a little bit like childlike or whatever, like you still don't feel silly with that person. You don't feel like there's any judgment or they're putting you down or like looking down on you in any way. They can just meet you at whatever stage of the process of whatever it is you're going through. They can kind of meet you there, and like reflect back their honest feedback or like help
Mm.
you and guide you with their honest feedback, but it doesn't have that layer of kind of judgment that comes with it as well.
Yeah, and then it also kind of goes in the reverse. Like that person also needs to feel safe with you, that you're going to be able to receive what they're going to be able to say. Because that term, like walking on eggshells. Like you don't want to have to feel that people have to walk on eggshells around you, and you don't want to have to feel like you have to walk on eggshells around them. Meaning, that they're like someone could be really easily upset, or they're not open to receiving something.
Yeah.
So I think that they're all sort of signs that like this relationship doesn't necessarily feel like it's safe to be that full expression of you, which I
Yeah.
think that is what intimacy really is.
Completely. And I think that into like healthy intimacy as well, in this, and it sounds like they kind of come from opposite ends, but I think they're actually part of the same whole, which is intimacy
Mm.
and boundaries and
Oh yeah.
intimacy and like honest communication, where to have really true, safe, healthy intimacy with somebody, how many times are we going to say the word intimacy? Like I'm just saying that word on repeat. But you need to be able to express your boundaries because what you're doing is you're giving the other person permission to have boundaries as well. That's often how when clients really push against working on or implementing boundaries and they have all that self-talk about like, I don't want to burden the other person. I don't want to insult them. I'm like, with a healthy person that you are in an intimate exchange with, they want you to have boundaries because that's giving them
Mm.
barriers that are help guide what is appropriate for you or what's helpful for you or unhelpful for you, and it also gives them permission to have boundaries with you too. Like what we're doing for ourselves is also a demonstration to other people who we're in those like
Yes.
intimate partnerships with,
Yeah.
and it's a great barometer. If it's not a healthy person, they're probably not going to have a great reaction to that.
Yeah, a huge turning point for me with boundaries was like a long time ago when I was setting boundaries with a family member
Mm.
that was learning that me setting boundaries with them was actually my attempt of keeping us close,
Yeah.
not further away. Because for us
Mm.
to have a healthy relationship, we needed to have boundaries in the relationship. So even kind of being able to reframe that as it's not you trying to create space, you're actually trying to create like not distance between you, but healthy space between the relationship.
Yes, I actually remember you saying that because that really struck me where it's again like if it's somebody who doesn't receive that well, then it's that my way or the highway stuff that you're talking about. Like we either have this relationship or family dynamic or whatever it is like on my terms or we don't have it at all, which just goes to show like there's not a lot of compromise there and therefore there's not a lot of safety. You cannot have intimacy if you don't have trust and safety.
Yeah, you're instantly going to get to these roadblocks of being like, this is as intimate as the relationship can be because you're not meeting me where I'm at
Yeah.
as well.
And then like you have
Um,
no choice but to protect yourself. And that often means
exactly.
to
Walls
not be
up.
no more access. Bye bye.
Which I think this really speaks to why specifically people with eating disorders struggle with intimacy. I think there's multiple reasons, but a big one is that kind of that difficulties with trust, sort
Yeah.
of combined with a bit of people pleasing. I think it's very common for people who struggle with eating disorders to have, a fear of rejection or like low self-esteem and self-worth, which I think can often really play out in the people pleasing of not wanting to sort of be turbulent or not wanting to make an issue for anyone else. But I think those intimacy issues are then so intertwined with trust issues. Like, for example, emotional intimacy literally relies on trust. So if you're struggling to feel emotionally or physically safe, whether that be from past experience or not, it's not unlikely that, like you're saying, you're going to attempt to really protect yourself from getting hurt by having these walls up.
Yeah, I think the idea of intimacy to somebody who's in an eating disorder or even, early in recovery, whatever it might be, is terrifying because it's when you like an eating disorder, I see as like one of the ultimate rejections of self. Like
Yeah.
when it's one of my favorite reframes to do with people when they'll say, but Mia, like if this happens because of recovery, I'll be judged and I'll be rejected. And I'm like, what does it sound like in your head at the moment? Like, do
Oh,
you
I love
listen to
that
judgment
reframe.
24/7? Like, and wouldn't you say that the way that your eating disorder gets you to treat you is sort of a constant 24/7 rejection? Like somebody else
Mhm.
judges or rejects you, that's going to last for about half an hour and then you get to walk away from it. You don't get to walk out of your head, which is constant judgment and rejection. So I think
Yeah.
yeah, I think that if you are rejecting yourself, it's because of like a deep level of unworthiness, and not wanting to, like, I think as much as your eating disorder tries to distract other people from this core part of you that you don't want them to see, I think it's you doing that for yourself as well. Like, if I can put
Yeah.
all my stock into what my body looks like or into my behaviors or into being obedient or, doing the diet culture thing and winning at that, then I don't have to look at all the ways in which, like we talked about in the last episode, I am deeply flawed, etc. So, of course, if you're experiencing that internally, you don't want someone to see that.
Of course, and how's the irony of that, right? Trying to avoid, like you have this fear of rejection, so you're not, but you're actually the one that's rejecting yourself more than anything. Because I think there's so many of those little limiting beliefs that come up with this. I think a lot of people with eating disorders avoid relationships or end up kind of engaging in toxic relationships, which again, they're
Yeah.
different experiences, but I kind of just think they're symptoms of the same issue.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people have that belief of, what if this doesn't work out, right?
Mhm.
And then if this fear of what if it doesn't work out, and then that fear will confirm the beliefs that they have about their self-worth and value in the world.
Yeah.
Because I see so many people not putting themselves in situations to avoid the pain, but that fear of being hurt or, being let down is so significant that they're actually robbing themselves of the potential of experiencing so much joy and goodness.
Yeah.
And then the flip side of that is almost like that avoidance of true intimacy in the form of seeking, toxic relationships or staying in harmful relationships as well, and sort of repeating patterns of relationships that might lack genuine intimacy and are
Mhm.
rather sort of approached with masks as an attempt to
Yes.
keep yourself safe by, like you were saying, avoiding the vulnerability.
Yeah, I will explain it to clients when they're like, my eating disorder keeps me safe from judgment, rejection, all that stuff. And I'm like, yeah, by making you listen to it 24/7. And I would argue that the most painful rejection and judgment comes from within. Right? Like I would
Absolutely.
say it's the most painful version of it is a little bit like your eating disorder saying, I can keep you out of the rain. Like don't stand in the rain and get drizzled on. And the alternative it gives you is it takes you and it dunks you in the ocean and then holds you
It's
under.
a
And it's
waterfall.
like
Yeah.
you're not in the rain anymore. You're not getting wet in the rain, but you're just submerged in the friggin' ocean and completely drenched with, fighting for your life trying to get out. It's that irony of its solution always becomes the initial problem times a million.
Oh, absolutely. And I think on that as well, when people sort of get stuck in that of like, trusting the eating disorder, often a part of this is also going to be because there is that lack of those communication skills with themselves
Mm,
and then also with their external world, right? That person who's getting dunked in the ocean, they're not able to help seek, right? And even a step before that, maybe lacking a bit of that introspective awareness about their own needs at a certain moment. Which I think is it's a big thing as well. And when I think about my own experiences with intimacy, like lack of being able to communicate and help seek was a key player.
Mm,
Maybe and in addition to that, I feel like maybe one of the other biggest key players of intimacy issues with eating disorders, of course, is going to be body image issues.
yes.
Not feeling comfortable in your physical body
Mm.
obviously is going to mean there's going to be distress with the idea of having to be physically intimate, which I think again can either look like avoidance or disassociation.
Yeah. And then I think there's even like, I used to like think of myself in those settings, like being physically intimate with someone. And yes, it was the element of like not being comfortable in my body and not wanting them to see my body, etc. But then there was the next layer of like my hyper awareness of me being in my head about it. Being
Oh,
like, they're
oh,
going to pick
this
up
is
on that and they're going to think I'm crazy. So I just won't respond to that text message, nor will I ever leave the house again. Because it's like then the layers, right? Of like, yes, it's the physical, which is, I think, such a shared thing. And it's heartbreaking to see with clients and, obviously with the people who we're working with, because obviously we have such a shared lived experience with them, where that's probably like the one I've forgotten a lot about my eating. I don't feel when I have memories about my eating disorder, I don't have like a lot of visceral memories, but that's certainly one of them is like the disconnect from my physical being in those
yeah.
intimate moments. But more
Oh,
so, I am so in my head. I'm so in my head that all I can think about is how in my head I am. I can tell they can tell that I'm in my head. And then the feedback loop just being, well, like that just feels like more evidence that this is not meant for me.
exactly. Yeah, I resonate so much with that, like that visceral experience of it, because I
Mm,
also think that experience, it's a deeply, deeply lonely one. Because I think
mm.
I've said this before, when I went into recovery, I was in a relationship and our sex life was really hard. And,
Yeah.
because I obviously went through so many seasons of feeling just genuinely ashamed of my physical body. Like you were saying, the idea of having to be physically intimate made me feel physically sick.
Yes.
And I think like my response was either that like we were saying like avoidance or disassociation. And if it was
Mm,
avoidance, it obviously just created this current of like confused, not communicated emotion.
mm,
And then, I'm also referring to a relationship like I was 20. I'm pretty confident that both parties have way better communication skills and have hopefully evolved since then. But that second option, like you're talking about it, of engaging in that act, but being so disconnected from it, that that is that experience of complete disembodiment in
yeah.
every sense. And I
Mm,
think it really reinforces, for me, it really reinforced those already really present feelings of shame. Where I think for you, you're kind of describing it like you were just so in your head. I was like neither of these things. I was just not there.
yeah.
And it was super hard, obviously, for my partner as well. Because I really struggled to communicate my inner world. I would genuinely just shut down or cry,
Mm,
but
mm,
couldn't get words out. And for him, that was as much as it was for me, it was also incredibly lonely for him. Because I think,
yeah.
maybe like sleeping in a bed with someone back to back and feeling like that person doesn't want to roll over and hold you is
Oh
maybe like
God. Oh,
one of
that
the most lonely human
the back
experiences
to back.
I have. And so I very much acknowledge the loneliness in both parts of our experience, even though it was an incredibly supportive relationship. Because
Mm,
this whole thing about it's so complex, right? Fighting to avoid intimacy, but then also wanting it so badly, but for the
mm.
wrong reasons,
Yeah.
right? Um, it's I think when you're like a big feeling emotional person, like we both are, and you go through those stages of like emotional flatness, like you're just disconnected,
Mm.
that feels like death for a like big emotion person. Like it just feels
Yes.
so wrong. So
Yeah.
I think, yes, sexual intimacy was a huge part of my own experience. But,
And
in reflection on it, it's been so sorry, you go.
no, no, no. I just wanted to piggyback on before my brain takes me down the tangent. Um when you were saying like I just wasn't there, I also resonate with that because those moments are probably when I felt the most objectified and not by the other person, by myself. Like I felt like, when people talk about experiences of like floating above and looking, that's how I felt. Like I felt like I would never treated myself more like an ornament than in those moments where it was like there was absolutely nothing about the physical connection or experience or even just like me being in my body. Like everything was a judgment and like an assessment of my body and how the other person was perceiving my body. And like I was completely, as you said, like just disconnected, not there, because I really felt like I was a fly on the wall, and just like couldn't get back into my body because I was like, so I had to monitor like how it appeared from the outside.
Yeah. Oh wow. It's a really powerful conversation because I think it's an area of recovery that people don't talk about that much because it does feel a bit like obviously sex bit taboo and TMI. But it's so important to talk about it because these are these feelings where we have lacked intimacy
Yeah.
and then that has then affected our relationship with ourself. Obviously
Yes.
also the interpersonal relationships, but intimacy is as much about your relationship with yourself as it is
Mm,
with other people as well.
mm,
And the body holds so much. Like the body stores so much of our memory and feeling. So even when we're talking about this, us being like we can viscerally feel it. Because I think, sharing your body with someone is the most intimate thing that you can do as a human being. I mean, sharing
yeah.
your heart with them as well, but
Mm,
something about that physical connection, particularly when you're going through an illness and recovery, where part of it is that you are completely disconnected from your body. You are
yeah.
you are the walking head, right? So then to have to try and engage with the body in like communion with another person, it feels like a language that you don't know how to speak. And
Yes.
it can be incredibly distressing. I had always had this experience. It's only been in like recent years that I've reflected and been like, wow, that's so interesting. The body is this crazy thing. But after like I would go through these periods of, being in a relationship, occasionally having sex and then not, and just like not being, I was just vacant.
Mm,
I would then have an emotional response. Like I would just cry. And there was
yeah.
like no, there was no feeling behind it. It was just tears. And
Mm.
that continued for years, even when I wasn't in this relationship, which was so interesting, so interesting. And then you might have to cut this out. It might be a bit too TMI.
No.
And then, even years later with like different partners, I'd have to almost give them the pre-warning of being like, I potentially could cry after intimacy, and I'm not sad. I'm not
Yeah.
sad. It's just my body. It's just this bodily response, and I've
Yeah.
never been able to figure it out. And I feel like it really started in that time, which is so interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting that you say that, like, in those moments when you would get, like, have that kind of like dissociation, disconnected feeling, and then it
Yeah.
would result in like being emotional and your partner wanting you to explain, like, what's going on? Like, how do you feel? And like not being able to communicate it. I think people know by now we're both fairly verbose people. We're fairly clear communicators. I was always the same and still am sometimes, like when things get like overwhelming in that department, I sometimes just cannot connect what's going on in my brain to a clear, concise description of like how I'm feeling because it really, like you, like it harkens. I don't experience it nearly as intensely as I did when I was in my eating disorder, where I just had like I would, I would need to look at the feelings wheel and be like, I need to identify a feeling because I just couldn't put it into language, which I think is the ultimate indicator of like, not only are you not really capable of intimacy with other people when you're like that, but you have no, like the connection to self is just not there.
Absolutely. And I think that that connection to self goes, a few steps before the physical intimacy as well. Because if that connection to self isn't there, then it's
Mm,
not going to be there in that experience. I think another big thing for me was trying to achieve that like intimacy, right?
mm,
Through this facade version of self, which was never going to work, right? Like true intimacy can't be faked. It's this
no,
shared felt experience of connection. And look, for a short time, you can probably like fool other people, but ultimately you're being dishonest with yourself. And I think
yeah,
that's going to create further disconnection with yourself. So I think, in my own experience, my desires really limited the capacity for authentic intimacy. And what I mean by that, similar to that idea of, I'll only be happy if I have this body. I very much lived with when I was younger, that idea of I'll only be happy if I have a partner. Like that was that, and that was
yeah,
dictating a lot of my desires, which really limited the capacity for intimacy. And obviously,
mm,
it's a really narrowed view of what was going to bring me, of the happiness that I desired, with like no space for other options. And that
yeah,
meant that I wasn't in partnership for intimacy. I was there confirming a limiting belief that this is the only thing that's going to make me happy.
yeah,
And it wasn't the wanting of the love that was the problem. It was believing that this is the only thing that can make me happy. That's the problem.
mm,
And of course, as I've grown older, I've learned that that expectation that someone else is going to save me from who I am or, from what I have or don't have, it's crap. Expecting someone to fill a hole within you, impossible. It
mm,
was never going to be a partner's job. It had to be my job. So I think, I've seen over the years as I've reorientated to doing that work on myself first and actually really learning to like the person I am. Right. I
yeah,
think I knew once I was able to do that, I knew, hey, I'm okay right now. So I'm going to be okay in and also after this relationship. And that took off so much pressure for me. I think that level of self-assurance meant that, I can like the person I actually am when I'm in a relationship as opposed to wanting them to mold me and me
Yeah.
trying to fit into their life. I think that really speaks to self-intimacy for sure.
Yeah.
And, I think from learning that, it just really, it helped me be able to see the value in choosing people to share life with that make me feel safe to be me. Because I think when you find intimacy with those people, like we do with our best friends,
Mm.
it's kind of like they just reflect your goodness back onto you,
Yeah.
instead of by default supporting you to hide it. I love
Yeah.
that quote that I think it's something like, you can only love someone else as much as you love yourself or something like that. And I think it's the same with intimacy. It's like this continued experience of looking within to understand yourself and being curious about your needs and desires and flaws and all of it and really creating, self-compassion with that. And then looking out into the world, right? And being like, how can I now use this experience of self to create deeper intimacy with the people around me? And that absolutely starts with that vulnerability to self.
Yeah, and I think friendship is the best indicator of like how intimate, because what you're talking about with, your best friend being something that reflects back what's already there. Like your friends aren't there to create that within you, right? And
Yeah.
I really think that friendship is the baseline and the blueprint of what we should be seeking in those, intimate relationships with a partner as well. Because,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like what I was talking about with like that feeling of objectification in intimate, physical moments with people. It's because it's so much of what we're sold, right? Like that women are ornaments, and very often, like in media representation, it's like the woman is the ornament and the man is the one having the experience, right? And it's kind of like with this as well, where we're sold as women that it's the rom-com thing, right? Like they're together, all of her idiosyncrasies have been remedied.
Mm,
He is everything, and then the curtain comes down and it's done, right? Like we don't make this stuff up. We don't, create it for ourselves. It's something we're taught. And I think our eating disorders run with that, because an eating disorder is so much about the external and box ticking. And
yeah.
there's got to be a simpler solution than going deep and fixing it myself and really having to look at myself. Like maybe if I met someone and they loved me enough, that would be contagious and I would love myself too. And it's like we got to go down some painful roads to figure out that we've got the equation the wrong way around.
Absolutely. And I think also as a young person as well, you're dealing with that, but then you're also kind of pushing back against the expectation of what your life is like supposed to look like. Like this is
Yeah.
what is going to make sense. And it is fitting into that mold of like being the accessory for someone else's life, and I think even a feeling like you have to, it kind of even speaks to the idea of, you have to meet these certain milestones by certain ages as well. Like there's so much external pressure and ideologies that are going to try to create the foundation for your own experiences of love and intimacy.
Yeah.
And and you learn this through recovery. It's like it's about forging your own path.
Mhm.
I think a big thing I see with, young people that I work with, like girls, women who are, in their early kind of 20s area, is that we need to stop tying ourselves to these narrowly punitive visions that, you've got to date in your 20s and you need to find the ideal partner by this age and then have your first baby by this age. Otherwise, your life will be miserable. Because if that narrative happens, it'll be great in some ways, but it'll also be awful in some ways if you haven't learned how to love yourself. We need to show some bit more imagination of what a good life can actually look like.
Yeah.
And intimacy is a way to do that because intimacy, like we're exploring, it's not this single faceted experience. It's deeply complex and it's also has to be so understood by the individual.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, because a huge part of what I figured out in recovery and have embraced since is that it's not a strong instinct of mine to like partner up with somebody, uh,
Mm.
because I think in the patriarchal world that we live in, there's a few options there, and to me, a lot of them appear to be quite limiting. As far as like, I am a hyper independent person. I don't want to have anyone telling me what to do, or where I can. In other words, I'm not great with compromise in a relationship. And I value my own time and my own space. and my own life and what I've created. And I think part of that actually came from recovery and how proud I was and am of like what I've been able to build and how I was able to get myself out of that situation, what I've been able to turn it into. And I have so much appreciation for my freedom and for my ability to like truly captain my own ship. But I do have a lot of intimacy in my life. It's just not in sort of those conventional box stickers that
Yeah.
we're told, and I don't think men are to an extent told the same thing, like settle
Yeah.
down, partner up, blah 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 blah. And it's not to say that it's not on the cards for me, but as a woman in her like mid 30s, my very strong focus right now is this business. It is about the work that I do. It is about um the like the very specific independent way that I want to live my life at the moment, and that is where I am on my timeline. But yeah, that was a big part of my recovery, was really getting comfortable with like saying that I had permission to like get out of those boxes that we
Yeah.
are directly and
And
indirectly told is the answer, and that's safe, and everyone's just dying to get you in those boxes and tie you up in a bow so that they can feel okay. And it's like, but what if I feel like shit in that box? What if I feel
yeah.
trapped and terrible
And
and like I'm not living the life that I want to be living? So yeah, I think that regardless of whatever your great big epiphanies are in recovery, it's such an avenue. It can be such an avenue to like figuring out um, where you want to be and who you want to be and who you want with you when you're
yeah.
doing whatever it is that's
Yeah.
meant for you.
And how you want to get there as well. And I think this
Yeah.
almost speaks to, expanding the definition of intimacy. Like you can be intimate with your work. You can be
Yeah.
intimate with your days. You can be intimate and generous with your time. Like
Yeah.
it's not just about also in relation to other people and ourselves. It's in relation to how we are actually showing up in the world and how we are occupying space in our life as
Yeah.
well. It's like you very much part of that intimacy for you could be that you are very intimate with your dreams and
Yeah.
growing that. That's a
Mm.
beautiful form of intimacy because I think what in any sense, it's just adding a deeper layer of meaning to whatever it is.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
What did you kind of learn about intimacy through recovery as far as like ideally what that means for you? Like where are the glimmers of intimacy in your life?
I think, I live my life with a lot of intimacy and very, very intentionally. And that's the maybe problem. I feel like I say this all the time. That's the biggest thing recovery gave me. It's kind of never ending. Like all the things are as equally big and important. But it's that after going through years of my life where I was disconnected physically, emotionally, intellectually from myself, the idea of losing myself again
Mm,
is not an option. It's
mm,
just not an option. And it's not I'm not even talking about in a behavioral sense at all. I'm actually talking about that like felt sense of I'm intimate in my life. I can connect with myself.
yeah.
And that's why I think, it's also like, how we both love to romanticize our lives. Like this is part of it for me. It's like this is me being the biggest cliche ever, like walking around the streets of Paris listening to like the Taylor Swift song Paris.
I
Like
love it.
literally just on repeat. And like that's intimate time with myself. Like last night I went to Moulin Rouge and just took myself on like the most beautiful self date. Like got all
Yeah.
dressed up. I'm like literally not going with anyone. I'm actually just going on my own and had the most beautiful night. And that felt so intimate to me. When I'm reading a book before I go to bed, I make it intimate. I make it feel like meaningful. So I think to
Yes.
me, recovery gave me that experience of intimacy can be across the board in my life. And it's like, you could live a pretty similar life with someone else in terms of like whether it's conventional milestones or not, and places you live and places you study and jobs you do, but your life could be so much more intimate because of like the meaning you're attaching to it. So I think intimacy really comes into the bracket of like meaning and purpose for me in terms of like
Mm,
how I execute it in my everyday life. And it also, like you were saying before, friendship being the most important,
yeah.
kind of like, or not the most, but a really important aspect of intimacy. It also taught me to like don't skim read my friends,
Yeah.
don't have those surface level conversations if that's not what you want to have. Like
Mm,
ask someone the questions that you would want to be asked. Like these are the things that really help you get deeper with those friends. I have a couple of friends who like I just know when I'm ever going to see them like, okay, we're going to have some big conversations because they don't ask any basic questions. And I love that about them.
yeah. And I think, yeah, it's different layers of that too. Like tomorrow night I'm catching up with a girlfriend from who I like have known since high school. We've known each other for like 22 years now. And we have such a specific kind of intimacy. Like it's that connection back to our like I don't need to have the same conversations with all of my friends. Like the way that I relate to Josie is totally different to the way that I relate to Gem, right? And the fact that these people are like the keepers of parts of you or versions of you that you get to like reconnect back to and mirror back to
Yeah.
each other is so, so beautiful. And that's why I think that, and even in our friendship episode, Josie did say like she's in a partnership with Owen, who, I have known because Josie introduced me to him when we were like 21. Like I've known Owen forever and love and adore Owen, and Owen is an amazing partner. But Josie even said, she was like, the intimacy that I foster and like value the most is my friendships. And she's like, and I've got an amazing partner who I love and adore. But in terms of like the safety net that sits under all intimacy, like the friendship feels like the one that
Mm.
has been the most consistent and has been the most life-saving. So I think like that tapestry of like what different, it's kind of like when I do the help seeking mosaic with people, right? Like not everyone is going to be able to necessarily see you at your, rawest version, but maybe that's not the level of intimacy that you actually need met with that person, right?
Yes,
Like with Gem, we just
yes.
laugh about all what dickheads we were in high school, and all of that nostalgia and all of that sense of like growing up alongside each other is really, really beautiful. And that's a very specific way that we meet each other's needs.
Yes, because that's kind of like intimacy through experience, which I think would be like another aspect of intimacy. It's like moving through hard experiences with someone or growing up with someone or having a shared hobby or something, like that. That's also a way I think you can experience intimacy, particularly with friendships. I love what you're saying that all friendships are sort of like, you have this different, I would describe it as like as you have your own subculture with
Yeah.
different friends. It's like
Yeah.
how you communicate what that relationship is. And that makes it so much more special because it's your subculture. No one else has to understand it.
Yeah, like that, very often I'll be talking to any one of my friends and like think if anybody heard this, they would think we were speaking a different language. Like this is just shorthand or references or whatever that would make absolutely no sense to anybody else who would overhear it or be, sitting in on this conversation. And that's such a special indicator of like that shared lived experience together. And it's kind of like what we do. You and I have just experienced this. We're doing calls at the moment for the Bali retreat, and how many people, when we ask them like what speaks to you about the retreat, the same consistent things are coming through. Like even that intimacy of what we share with people along this recovery path of that unspoken language together is so powerful. I think that's probably one of the um, most powerful demonstrations of intimacy I've ever experienced and witnessed is when it's done in a healthy way, the way that community can provide intimacy for people like going through the recovery process. Like
Yeah.
obviously, intimacy is a very personal word when we're talking about like a coach and a client. It's a little too personal, but
Yeah.
just as two people who have been through a hellish experience that are similar to each other, there is just like an unspoken level of vulnerability and seeing each
Mm.
other in a way that people who've known you your whole life, like in that sense, Josie knows every part of me because she hasn't had an eating disorder. There's a part of me she sees, but she doesn't recognize it because it's such a specific experience that I share with
Mm.
people who have been through an eating disorder, if that makes sense.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, so for people in recovery who are really struggling with intimacy, I think that's sort of the first step. Start with relationships that maybe already have this established level of safety and understanding like how can I actually show up more vulnerably or more intimately with this relationship as opposed to kind of jumping into the romantic relationship approach. Because I think
Please
doing
don't
that,
go on 100 hinge dates after you listen to this episode. That is not what we're saying.
that is not
It
what we
is
were
a
saying at all.
nightmare out there. Huh?
Um, but to really, yeah, start with friendships and then do some of that self-work. And if some of those things that we were saying, like fear of rejection or low self-worth or people pleasing, you feel like might be causing friction with your ability to be able to connect intimately, they're the flags. They're the things to look at first before necessarily jumping into romantic partnership, if that is what you desire.
Yeah, and I think as you say, like look for and it's kind of like we've talked about in like friendship episodes and connection episodes. Um, there are people in your life who are already modeling that they are safe and that they are,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
options for this. And it might just be more the inner talk and the barrier that comes from within that needs to be unpacked. It's kind of like when people say, no one will help me, no one can help me. And then when we get down to the specifics, they're like, well, they could, but I'm actually terrified to ask, right? So I think that having a space to unpack maybe some of those barriers and some of those fears and some of those beliefs is really important too, because you probably did learn somewhere that intimacy wasn't safe or it wasn't consistent or it was it came at a price or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
just like everything else, all these mindset shifts that we can do in recovery, we can do that. This can be an avenue to explore that here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just remembering that relationships are so complex. There's not always going to be like an obvious decision in terms of, how to challenge yourself and not taking it too far, but also acknowledging, your window of tolerance and what safety feels like to you. You need to get, kind of like intimate with the idea of what safety actually feels like for you to feel emotionally and intellectually and physically safe.
Yeah.
And that does come through experience.
Yes. Yeah. But again, don't go and do it on 100 hinge dates.
No, no, no.
But I think that this was really beautiful, and I, hope that people, um, yeah, just can see themselves in some of these things. Where, as always, like we're not coming from a place of we are now perfect, completely evolved human beings. This is one of those things that is part of like the human experience. But as we always say, like recovery can just be such a framework to, as we often do say, like we wouldn't just do this work if it was about just food and body and all that kind of stuff. There is the opportunity to really develop in areas and really get honest with yourself in areas that otherwise you might go your whole life not looking at, because you deserve to be seen and,
Yeah.
embraced as your whole wonderful self. But the first person who needs to do that for you is you.
Oh, amen. Great way to finish the podcast, Mel.
Take me to church.
Bingo.
No ditto, just bingo. Um, so as always, let us know what you think in the comments below. Love doing this with you. Love doing this for the people. We appreciate your feedback as always. Don't ever hesitate to let us know if there's something you'd like us to talk about. And we will chat to you in the next episode from wherever Holly is having a fabulous time as her tour of Europe comes to a close.
I will see you then.